World War II ended over 80 years ago. Major Battle has documented, decoded secret messages, and interviews of thousands of survivors have been conducted. We know how Hitler died. We know where the bombs fell. We know the names of the generals, the dates of the invasions, and the casualty counts down to the last digit. But here's the thing. Beneath all that documented history, there's another story. One that doesn't fit into neat timelines or official records. Stories of expeditions to Tibet searching for ancient Aryan roots. Stories of bell-shaped devices that supposedly bent gravity. Stories of submarines arriving in Argentina months after the war ended, their logbooks destroyed, their cargo unknown. These aren't just conspiracy theories. They're based on real operations, real people, and real documents that either vanished or were deliberately destroyed. Today, you're going to hear about the strangest unsolved mysteries of World War II. But more importantly, you're going to understand what they reveal about the Nazi regime itself. How desperation and ideology can twist science into sorcery, how secrecy breeds legend, and how the line between fact and fantasy becomes impossible to see when you're convinced you're destined to rule the world. This is the story of how the Third Reich didn't just wage war with tanks and guns. They waged it with myths, relics, and the belief that somewhere out there, hidden in mountain monasteries or underground laboratories, was the key to ultimate power. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And sit back, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about World War II. The foundation of madness. Let's start at the beginning. Not in 1939 when the war started, but in the early 1930s when the Nazi Party was still consolidating power. Most people think of Hitler's regime as brutally rational. Industrial genocide, blitzkrieg warfare, calculated expansion. And that's partly true. But there was another dimension to the Nazi worldview. One that mixed pseudo-science with mysticism, archaeology with occultism, and academic research with pure fantasy. The architect of this dimension wasn't Hitler himself. It was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler believed in things that would make most people laugh. He believed in hidden energies. He believed that runes held magical power. He believed that somewhere in history there had been an advanced Aryan civilization that held the secrets to dominating the world. And as the head of the SS, he had the resources to act on these beliefs. In 1935, Himmler founded an organization called the Ahnenerbe. Officially, it was a research and teaching society dedicated to exploring Germanic ancestral heritage. In practice, it was something far stranger. The Ahnenerbe employed archaeologists, anthropologists, linguists, and what we might politely call pseudo-scientists. Their job was to find evidence, any evidence, that supported Nazi racial ideology. They dug up Germanic grave sites. They studied runic inscriptions looking for hidden spiritual energies. They pored over theosophical literature that claimed Aryans descended from Atlantis or a lost polar homeland. Here's where it gets important. This wasn't a fringe operation. The Ahnenerbe had state backing, SS funding, and academic credentials. Universities that would normally dismiss these ideas as crackpot fantasies now had to take them seriously because the regime demanded it. The narrative they were building went something like this. Europe's Aryan race didn't just evolve in Europe. They had roots in a far older, more sophisticated culture. One possibly located in Central Asia, or the Himalayas. And this is where Tibet enters the story. The Nazis had appropriated the swastika as their symbol. But here's what fascinated Himmler and his circle. The swastika wasn't originally German. It was an ancient symbol that appeared in cultures across Asia, including Tibet. To most scholars, this was just evidence of cultural diffusion, symbols traveling along trade routes. But to the Nazis, it was proof. Proof that Aryans had once spread across Asia. Proof that Tibetan Buddhism might hold clues to ancient Aryan origins. Proof that somewhere in the Himalayas there might be monasteries preserving secret knowledge from a lost golden age. This wasn't rational thinking, but it was convincing to people who wanted to believe it. And that's the critical point. Nazi occultism wasn't about evidence. It was about confirming what they already believed. So Himmler authorized an expedition, a real funded multi-year expedition to Tibet, not just to study the culture but to find tangible proof of Aryan ancestry, to measure skulls, to search for relics, to gain access to hidden teachings. This expedition happened. The question is, what did they really find? Expedition to the Roof of the World. The expedition was led by a zoologist named Ernst Schaefer. On paper, this was a scientific mission to collect biological specimens and study Tibetan ethnography. Schaefer had been to Tibet before. He knew the terrain, he knew the challenges, and he knew how to pitch it as legitimate research. But for Himmler, this was never about zoology. This was about finding living proof of his cherished theory that an Aryan lineage ran through Tibetan culture. The team departed in 1938, right before the war officially started. They carried standard scientific equipment, cameras, measuring instruments, specimen containers. But they also carried things that had nothing to do with biology: runic compendiums, theosophical texts, and instruments allegedly designed to detect earth currents, or geomagnetic energies. Reaching Tibet wasn't easy. Geopolitically, the region was closed to most Westerners. The British, who controlled India, were suspicious of Nazi motives. But the Germans positioned the trip as pure scholarship and slipped through. The journey itself was brutal: towering mountain passes, punishing altitude, near constant cold. They hired local porters who must have been mystified by these Germans lugging bizarre equipment across precarious trails. From the diaries that survived, we know they collected flora and fauna samples. We know they took thousands of photographs. And we know they measured skulls, an obsession in Nazi pseudo-science, where they believed racial differences could be determined by cranial shapes. But here's where the story gets murky. Eyewitness accounts that emerged after the war suggest the SS officers carried out other activities that weren't in the official mission plan. They allegedly performed surveys under the guise of anthropological study, searching for ley lines or energy fields. They allegedly pressed local guides to lead them to remote hermitages, hoping to access esoteric teachings. They allegedly examined ancient manuscripts looking for references to tall, pale-skinned ancestors or lost kingdoms. Were these accounts real, or were they invented after the war to make the expedition seem more dramatic? We don't know. The official records say nothing about midnight temple visits or secret chambers, but the absence of documentation doesn't mean it didn't happen. It might just mean it was never meant to be documented. When they finally reached Lhasa, the Tibetan capital, they secured an audience with officials. The Dalai Lama was young then, so a regent handled foreign visitors. The Germans were treated politely but cautiously. Western visitors were rare. Standard accounts mention the grandeur of the Potala Palace, the monastic complexes, the reverence that defined Tibetan Buddhist life. All very academic, very proper. But rumor persists that certain team members went further, that they bribed guides to lead them to hidden hermitages, that they examined centuries-old manuscripts in secret, that they were searching for something specific, references to ancient Aryans, descriptions of lost civilizations, or relics with mystical properties. One recurring motif is the swastika itself. In Tibetan Buddhism, a form of the swastika had been used for centuries as a symbol of good fortune. To the Nazi visitors, seeing this symbol in Tibetan art was like finding a fingerprint. They declared it proof that Aryans had left their mark on this distant land. Some accounts claim Tibetan monks were disturbed to see the Nazi version of the swastika, angled differently, used as a political emblem. But official expedition records say almost nothing about these interactions. Either they happened behind closed doors, or they were fabricated later to add mystique to the story. If the SS contingent hoped to find a treasure trove of esoteric relics or undeniable proof of Aryan ancestry, they were disappointed. The diaries that survived show conventional anthropological data: measurements of villagers' faces and skulls, lists of local wildlife, genealogical notes, local myths recounted by interpreters. Nothing earth-shattering. The expedition returned to Germany in early 1939 with crates of Tibetan artifacts, photographs, and specimens. Himmler praised them. The Ahnenerbe issued press releases touting the mission as a great success in unraveling the history of early peoples. But then the war started, and everything changed. The materials from Tibet were catalogued in Ahnenerbe archives and selectively used in propaganda about Eastern Aryan offshoots. But no grand revelation emerged, no doomsday relic, no secret that would turn the tide of war. The expedition faded into obscurity as armies marched and tanks rolled across Europe. But here's the thing. The legend didn't die, it just hibernated. After the war, when the world discovered the full horror of the Holocaust, people struggled to understand how a modern, industrialized nation could embrace such evil so completely. The idea that Hitler's circle was guided, or corrupted, by occult forces became a psychological crutch. It cast the Nazi leadership as something more than human wickedness, something touched by dark mysticism. And the Tibetan expedition became a key piece of that narrative. Books and documentaries started claiming the expedition had found hidden masters in the Himalayas, that they'd discovered powerful relics, that they'd gained access to secret knowledge that nearly changed the war's outcome. None of this appears in official records, but conspiracy theorists point to that absence as evidence of a cover-up. Of course, there's no official record, they say. It was too dangerous to document. So, what's the truth? The truth is that the expedition happened. Real SS officers went to Tibet. They conducted pseudo-scientific research to support Nazi racial ideology. And they returned with nothing more than propaganda material. But the significance isn't about what they found. It's about what the expedition reveals. How easily political fanaticism can dress itself up as science. How ideology can turn scholarship into a tool for propaganda. And how the hunger for validation can send powerful men chasing myths halfway around the world. The Nazi regime wasn't just waging war on battlefields, they were waging war on reality itself, trying to force the world to conform to their delusions about Aryan supremacy. And Tibet was just the beginning. The Bell in the Mountains. While the Ahnenerbe was chasing mystical artifacts, another branch of the Nazi war machine was pursuing something else entirely, something that blurred the line between advanced technology and impossible physics. Deep in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, in what was then eastern Germany, now southwestern Poland, rumors have circulated for decades about an extraordinary secret project. Its codename, Die Glocke, the bell. By certain accounts, it was a bell-shaped device that defied easy classification, a machine tied to experiments that allegedly distorted gravity, manipulated time, and emitted radiation so lethal it killed everyone who came near it. More concrete evidence? Almost none. The story exists in layers of classified documents, lost testimonies, and the silent grave of an SS general named Hans Kammler, who supposedly oversaw the project. So was Die Glocke real? Or is it just another legend born from wartime chaos and post-war speculation? Let's look at what we actually know. The Owl Mountains were home to a massive subterranean construction effort codenamed Reese, Giant. Prisoners from concentration camps were forced to excavate deep tunnels into the hillsides under brutal conditions. Officially, this was meant to create secret factories or command bunkers shielded from Allied bombers. But a subset of rumor contends that within this labyrinth was a facility far more secret than any standard bunker. It was allegedly run by scientists under Hans Kammler's command. Kammler had risen through the SS ranks with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. By 1944-45, he controlled significant portions of the Reich's secret weapons programs, from V-2 rocket production to advanced jet aircraft development. Documents confirm Kammler's role in these programs, but his involvement with something called Die Glocke, that's where documentation becomes scarce and speculation runs wild. The physical description of Die Glocke comes from post-war testimonies and scattered references. It's said to have been a metallic bell-shaped object about 9 feet tall and 5 feet in diameter at the base. Inside were 2 cylinders that rotated in opposite directions, filled with a substance codenamed Zerum 525, described as a violet-hued, heavy metallic liquid, possibly mercury-based, possibly infused with radioactive isotopes. When activated, the cylinders supposedly spun at high speed. The device was housed in a large chamber with thick ceramic or lead lining connected to massive cables from an industrial generator. According to accounts, once powered up, lethal radiation emanated from the machine. Plant matter would wither, forming a crystalline residue. Animals would die. Researchers forced to stand close suffered gruesome side effects: nervous system damage, fluid in the lungs, sores across their bodies, eventual death. All of this, so the legend goes, was in pursuit of something extraordinary. Some versions claim Die Glocke had anti-gravitational properties. Others suggest it could reduce mass or manipulate space-time itself. The claims are extraordinary, which naturally invites extraordinary skepticism. Mainstream historians consider these stories to be at best anecdotal, possibly based on misinterpretations of nuclear research equipment or chemical centrifuges. But there are a few tangible threads that keep the legend alive. First, the fly trap. Near the Wenceslaus mine, not far from the Rees tunnels, there's a strange concrete structure. It's shaped like an open cooling tower base, a circular array of thick pillars. Officially, its purpose is unclear. Maybe it was an industrial cooler. Maybe a water tower foundation. But the vacuum of documentation encourages speculation that it was a test rig for Die Glocke, a platform to suspend the device during experiments. According to rumor, on test days, bright violet glows could be seen above the facility, accompanied by a metallic humming that set teeth on edge. Second, Hans Kammler's fate. As the war ended, multiple contradictory reports surfaced about his death. Some said he died in battle near Prague. Others insisted he took his own life. But his death was never conclusively documented, and no body was ever found. This uncertainty feeds theories that he escaped, spirited away by U.S. or Soviet forces, potentially bartering advanced weapons secrets for his freedom. Or that he fled with Die Glocke's plans, ensuring they vanished from the historical record. Here's where we need to separate possibility from fantasy. If Die Glocke existed, the most plausible explanation is that it was a high-intensity centrifuge for nuclear enrichment or isotopic separation. The lethal radiation aligns with crude attempts to handle radioactive materials. Cerium-525 could be code for a thorium or uranium compound. The Nazi nuclear program was behind the Allies, but they were attempting fission research. A device large enough to hold rotating apparatus, requiring thick shielding, would explain the basic facts without invoking anti-gravity or time travel. The bizarre stories about time distortion might have emerged from confusion among laborers who glimpsed the device but never received an explanation. Or they might have been invented later to dramatize the story. But here's what's undeniable. The Nazis poured enormous resources into desperate wonder weapon projects in the war's final year. They believed a single miraculous discovery might reverse their fortunes. Under that kind of pressure, SS leadership might well have condoned experiments that were scientifically outlandish and ethically monstrous. That environment, swirling with secrecy, desperation, and delusion, is the perfect incubator for legends. After the war, the Allies scoured Germany for advanced technology. Operation Alsos cataloged nuclear labs, rocket sites, advanced weapon prototypes. They found plenty: supersonic wind tunnels, jet aircraft designs, V-2 rockets. But in all those documents and interviews with captured scientists, no direct mention of a bell-shaped device surfaced. Could it be that Die Glocke research was so compartmentalized that only a handful knew about it? Could the knowledge have been suppressed as too dangerous? Or could it simply never have existed? The story gained traction decades later through researchers like Igor Witkowski, a Polish investigator who claimed to have uncovered transcripts of an SS officer's interrogation describing the device. But critics question the authenticity of his sources. No confirmed copy of those interrogation documents has ever emerged for scholarly review. Subsequent authors seized on these claims, weaving them into broader speculation about Nazi anti-gravity research and zero-point energy. Whether or not the device was real, the story tells us something crucial about the Nazi regime in its final days. They were building for a reality that didn't exist. They were convinced that somewhere, in hidden laboratories, in ancient texts, in exotic physics, was the key to ultimate victory. And they were willing to sacrifice lives and resources pursuing that fantasy. This wasn't rational strategy. It was desperation dressed up as science. It was the complete breakdown of the line between what's possible and what's desired. And when the war ended in chaos, with key figures dead or missing and entire archives destroyed, that breakdown left behind perfect conditions for myth to flourish. The bell in the mountains, glowing violet in the night, promising power beyond comprehension. It's a perfect symbol of what the Nazi regime had become. A machine that ate resources and lives, pursuing an impossible dream. leaving nothing behind but rumors and questions. The submarine that wouldn't surrender. It's July 10th, 1945. The war in Europe ended 2 months ago. Hitler is dead. Berlin is rubble. The Third Reich is gone. But off the coast of Mar del Plata, Argentina, something impossible appears. A German U-boat surfaces in broad daylight, flying no flag, approaching the port as if the war never ended. The Argentine Navy scrambles. Coastal lookouts spot the submarine. Radio calls go out to higher authorities. Has this U-boat come to surrender, or is something else happening? The submarine is U-530, and its arrival in Argentina, months after Germany's surrender, would become one of World War II's most persistent mysteries. Because when Argentine officers boarded the vessel, they found something disturbing. Every logbook had been destroyed. Every war diary, every coded message, every personal journal, systematically removed or burned. The deck gun was missing, apparently jettisoned at sea. The torpedoes were gone. Even the conning tower's identification markings had been painted over. The crew offered a simple explanation. They followed orders to surrender in a neutral country. But their official chain of command had collapsed months ago, and the systematic destruction of all records suggested they were hiding something. So the question became, what cargo did U-530 carry across the Atlantic? And more disturbingly, what passengers might they have dropped off before arriving in Argentina? To understand the mystery, you need to understand the chaos of Germany's final weeks. By late April 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Hitler was in his Berlin bunker. Allied forces were closing in from all sides. U-boats still at sea faced an impossible choice: surrender to the Allies, scuttle themselves, or try to reach friendly shores. U-530's commander, Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth, was somewhere in the Atlantic when Germany surrendered on May 8th. Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor, had ordered all U-boats to cease operations and surrender at designated ports. But U-530 didn't comply. Instead, it continued west and south, far from any designated surrender point. The journey from European waters to Argentina takes weeks, even at a U-boat's best speed, and during that time, U-530 was running dark. No radio contact, no identification signals, avoiding all Allied patrols. Why? The most sensational theory emerged almost immediately. Hitler didn't die in the bunker. He escaped via submarine to Argentina. Sound crazy? It captured imaginations for a reason. First, Argentina under President Juan Perón had shown sympathy to certain Nazi elements. The country had pockets of German immigrants, and Perón's government wasn't hostile to providing asylum. Second, there were persistent rumors in the German Navy about escape routes to South America. These weren't entirely fiction. After the war, thousands of Nazis and collaborators did flee to Argentina, though most traveled by conventional means in the late 1940s. Third, Hitler's death in the bunker, while well documented, wasn't verified by the Western Allies for some time. The Soviets controlled Berlin. Bodies were burned. In the chaos, anything seemed possible. So when U-530 appeared in Argentina with no logs and no clear explanation, conspiracy theorists had their proof. This was Hitler's escape vessel. The theory had problems. Multiple witnesses confirmed Hitler's death. Forensic evidence supported it. The timeline barely worked. But conspiracy theories don't need to be perfect. They just need to be compelling. And U-530's mysterious voyage was nothing if not compelling. When Argentine authorities interrogated the crew, they got a consistent but vague story. They left port in late April, roamed the Atlantic, lost contact with command, and decided to seek refuge in Argentina once the war ended. They claimed there was no special cargo, no passengers, no secret mission. They destroyed the logs because they contained operational codes that shouldn't fall into enemy hands. The U.S. authorities who took custody after Argentina conducted their own investigation. They found no trace of gold, no advanced weapons, no sign of Hitler or other Nazi leadership. The official conclusion: U-530 was just a stray, a submarine crew that refused to surrender in Europe and sought better terms in South America. But that explanation never quite satisfied. First, the timeline. The war ended May 8th. U-530 arrived July 10th. That's over 2 months. You can cross the Atlantic in that time, but it's also enough time to make stops, to drop off cargo or passengers at remote locations along the coast. Second, the systematic destruction of records. Yes, U-boat captains sometimes discarded sensitive documents before surrender. But the thoroughness here, every log, every diary, even personal journals, suggested something beyond standard operating procedure. Third, the missing equipment. The deck gun, gone. Torpedoes, gone. Why strip the boat so completely? Fourth, crew testimonies were vague and contradictory. Some said they lingered in the North Atlantic for weeks. Others claimed they meandered aimlessly. When pressed on specific dates or locations, memories became fuzzy. What amplified the mystery was this: U-530 wasn't alone. Another U-boat, U-977, also appeared in Argentina a month later in August 1945. Its commander told a similar story. They'd been at sea when the war ended, decided to avoid capture, and sailed to Argentina. 2 submarines, both refusing to surrender in Europe, both arriving in Argentina, both with incomplete or destroyed records. Local Argentine newspapers went wild. Headlines screamed about hidden treasure, smuggled Nazis, secret bases in Patagonia. The government tried to downplay it, but the rumors were unstoppable. The most likely explanation is simpler than Nazi escape plots, but still significant. U-boat crews knew what awaited them in Allied captivity. At minimum, years in POW camps. At worst, trials for war crimes. German submariners had waged unrestricted warfare, sinking civilian ships. They had reason to fear harsh treatment. Argentina offered a third option, neutral ground where they might negotiate better terms, or at least delay the inevitable. As for the destroyed logs, they might have contained evidence of war crimes, attacks on hospital ships, civilian vessels, violations of maritime law. Destroying those records was self-preservation. But the timing, arriving months after surrender, suggests they might have been waiting for instructions that never came, or waiting to rendezvous with other vessels that didn't show up. Or yes, possibly waiting after dropping off cargo or passengers at remote locations. We'll never know for certain because the men who sailed U-530 took their full story to their graves. What makes U-530 significant isn't what it proves. It doesn't prove Hitler escaped or that secret Nazi bases existed in Argentina. What it proves is how the chaos at war's end created perfect conditions for conspiracy theories to flourish. When regimes collapse, records get destroyed, witnesses die, chain of command breaks down. And in that vacuum, anything becomes plausible. The Nazi regime had created so many secrets, from concentration camps to wonder weapons, that people were primed to believe in more secrets: hidden submarines, escaped war criminals, buried gold. Some of those secrets were real. Thousands of Nazis did escape to South America. Wealth stolen from Holocaust victims was hidden in Swiss banks. Secret weapons programs did exist. But not every rumor was true, and U-530 became a screen onto which people projected their theories about what else might be hidden. Here's what we know for certain. U-530 crossed the Atlantic after the war ended, destroyed all documentation, and surrendered in Argentina. Here's what we don't know: why they chose that route, whether they dropped off cargo or passengers, what orders, if any, they received in those chaotic final weeks. And here's the bigger question: does it matter? Because whether or not U-530 carried Hitler to Argentina, it didn't. Whether or not it smuggled gold, probably not. Whether or not it delivered weapons or documents, possibly. The submarine represents something real. It represents how the Nazi regime, even in defeat, maintained its culture of secrecy. How desperation drove men to irrational choices. How the machinery of the Third Reich didn't just stop on May 8, 1945, it scattered, splintered, and vanished into the shadows. And those shadows are still with us. The Vanishing Squadron, June 1945. The war in Europe is over. The Pacific Theater is still raging, but for Allied forces in British India, it's mostly administrative work now. Supply runs, personnel transfers, routine flights. On a humid morning, a British Avro Anson designated Flight KG-867 lifts off from a makeshift airfield in eastern India. It's a twin-engine transport plane carrying senior RAF and Army officers across the Bay of Bengal on official business. The flight plan is straightforward. Follow a recognized corridor across the northern stretches of the bay. Touchdown at a forward airfield to the southeast. Flight time, a few hours. Weather, mild with some monsoon clouds but nothing unusual. The pilot is qualified. The navigator is experienced. The plane is maintained. This is the kind of flight that happens dozens of times every week. At 0800 hours, the Anson takes off. Ground control gets a confirmation. KG-867 airborne, all conditions green. For the first half hour, everything is normal. Position reports come in on schedule. Mild turbulence, patchy visibility, but nothing concerning. Then at 0835, flight KG-867 goes silent. Ground controllers try to raise them. Static. They try again. Nothing. Other stations join the attempt. Just faint crackles that might be interference. At first it seems like a simple radio malfunction. These things happen. But as minutes turn to hours and no further signals arrive, unease spreads. By midday, it's clear something is seriously wrong. Flight KG-867, carrying senior personnel, has vanished somewhere over the Bay of Bengal. And they're never seen again. Reconnaissance aircraft are dispatched immediately. They comb the suspected flight path, scanning the ocean for any sign of wreckage. Nothing. No debris. No oil slick. No distress beacon. No survivors in rafts. Naval vessels are alerted. The search expands. Over the next 2 weeks, hundreds of sorties are flown. Thousands of square miles are searched. Every possible route is considered, including the possibility that the pilot turned back if encountering trouble. Still nothing. It's as if Flight KG-867 simply dropped off the map. No trace, no clue, no answer. When an aircraft disappears, there are usually explanations. Mechanical failure, weather, pilot error, enemy action. Even in 1945, investigators had protocols for determining what happened. But Flight KG-867 defied all of them. Mechanical failure? Possible. But the plane was maintained and the pilot experienced. Even with engine failure, there should have been a distress call, and catastrophic structural failure would have left debris. Weather? The day was relatively calm. No major storms were reported in the area. Tropical squalls can appear suddenly, but they don't erase all evidence of a crash. Enemy action? By June 1945, the Bay of Bengal was firmly under Allied control. Japanese forces were in retreat. The possibility of a surprise attack was extremely low. And again, there would have been some trace. The most disturbing theory emerged quietly in intelligence circles: sabotage. Here's what makes Flight KG-867 different from other missing aircraft: the passengers. They weren't ordinary personnel. They were senior officers involved in intelligence and command operations. The exact nature of their mission remains partially classified even today. Some records suggest they were coordinating strategies for the ongoing Pacific campaign. Others hint at intelligence operations related to post-war planning in Southeast Asia. If they were carrying sensitive information or documents, that would explain why the disappearance attracted high-level attention, and it would raise the possibility that someone wanted that flight to disappear. But who? And how? The war in Europe was over, but the Pacific theater was still active. Japanese intelligence networks, while degraded, still operated. Axis sympathizers in India existed, though they were closely monitored. Could a bomb have been planted? Possible, but security for senior officers was tight. Could there have been an inside job? Perhaps, but no evidence ever emerged pointing to specific individuals. The investigation went nowhere. The official file was eventually closed with a notation: lost at sea, cause unknown. Nearly 80 years later, we still don't know. The most likely explanation is a combination of mechanical failure and unfortunate timing. Perhaps the plane went down quickly in an area that wasn't thoroughly searched, or the wreckage sank in deep water where it couldn't be spotted. But the complete absence of any trace remains haunting. Even in deep water, debris typically floats. Oil slicks form. Life rafts inflate automatically. Flight KG-867 left nothing. What's significant about this case isn't just the mystery itself, it's how it fits into a pattern. Throughout World War II, aircraft, ships, and personnel vanished in ways that defied explanation. Some were later accounted for. Others, like KG-867, remain unsolved. And when you look at these cases together, you start to see something. The machinery of war creates blind spots. Chaos zones where documentation breaks down, where witnesses die, where physical evidence is destroyed or lost. The Nazi regime exploited these blind spots deliberately. They built entire programs around secrecy and compartmentalization. But even Allied forces with better record-keeping and less paranoia had gaps. Flight KG-867 fell into one of those gaps, and once you're in a gap, you never come out. The real mystery. Let's step back and look at what we've covered. A Nazi expedition to Tibet searching for ancient Aryan roots. An alleged bell-shaped device in the Owl Mountains that supposedly bent gravity. A submarine arriving in Argentina months after the war ended. A routine flight vanishing without trace. 4 very different mysteries. But they all share something crucial. They exist in the space between documented fact and complete fantasy. The Tibet expedition happened. We have photographs, journals, and official records. But did it involve secret searches for mystical relics? Maybe. The evidence is thin and contradictory. Die Glocke might have existed as some kind of experimental device. But was it an anti-gravity machine? Almost certainly not. More likely it was nuclear research equipment that's been mythologized beyond recognition. U-530 definitely sailed to Argentina. But did it carry Hitler or secret cargo? Probably not, though the destroyed logs ensure we'll never know the full story. Flight KG-867 absolutely disappeared. But was it sabotage, accident, or something else? The investigation found nothing conclusive. What all these cases reveal is this: the line between history and legend is thinner than we'd like to believe. Why do these mysteries endure? Why do people still write books about Nazi occultism or Hitler's escape to Argentina? Partly it's because the Nazi regime was so evil that people struggle to accept it as purely human. The Holocaust, the wars of aggression, the systematic cruelty. It's easier to believe they were influenced by occult forces or possessed ancient knowledge than to accept that ordinary human beings created that horror through ideology and bureaucracy. The occult angle provides psychological distance. They were dabbling in dark magic is more comforting than they were just like us but chose evil. But there's another reason. The Nazis deliberately cultivated secrecy and mystery. They built programs in hidden bunkers. They destroyed records. They created compartmentalized cells where even high-ranking officials didn't know what others were doing. That deliberate secrecy created perfect conditions for conspiracy theories to grow. When you actively hide information, people assume you're hiding something significant. Here's the core revelation that ties all these mysteries together. The Nazi regime didn't just fight a conventional war. They waged war on reality itself. They believed so deeply in their ideology that they were willing to pursue any avenue, scientific, pseudo-scientific, or mystical, that might validate their worldview. Himmler genuinely believed in runic magic and Aryan mysticism. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's documented fact. He spent enormous resources on the Ahnenerbe precisely because he thought ancient Aryans held secrets worth finding. Other Nazi leaders poured resources into wonder weapons not because they were likely to work, but because desperation demanded miracle solutions. This is what happens when ideology overrides rationality. When the need to believe becomes more important than evidence. When the line between science and sorcery blurs. The Nazis didn't just commit horrific crimes, they did so while convincing themselves they were destined for greatness. And that combination of evil plus delusion created a regime that pursued both concentration camps and mystical expeditions, both genocide and searches for the Holy Grail. So let's be clear about what we know. The Tibet expedition was real, but found nothing of mystical significance. Die Glocke, if it existed at all, was probably nuclear research equipment, not an anti-gravity device. U-530 sailed to Argentina, but probably didn't carry Hitler or world-changing secrets. Flight KG-867 vanished, likely due to accident rather than conspiracy. These are the facts, but here's what matters more than the facts. The stories reveal how desperation and ideology can twist everything, how secrecy breeds mythology, how the absence of evidence gets interpreted as evidence of cover-ups, and most importantly, how a regime built on lies and delusion inevitably creates mysteries that outlast the regime itself. Because when you deliberately blur truth and fiction, when you build entire bureaucracies around pseudoscience and racial mythology, when you destroy records and hide your activities, you ensure that even after you're defeated, your shadow continues to distort reality. The legacy of secrecy. After Germany surrendered, something remarkable happened. The Allies launched a massive effort to capture German scientists, engineers, and technical experts. Operation Paperclip, as it was called, brought over 1,600 German specialists to the United States. Their backgrounds were hastily cleansed. Nazi party memberships downplayed, war crimes overlooked. Why? Because the Cold War was beginning, and the U.S. needed their expertise. Werner von Braun, who'd built V-2 rockets using slave labor, became the architect of America's space program. Kurt Debus, who'd worn an SS uniform, became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. The Soviet Union did the same thing. They captured German scientists and put them to work on rockets, jets, and nuclear weapons. But here's what's interesting. In all these interrogations, in all these debriefings, no one mentioned Die Glocke. No one described anti-gravity experiments. No one confirmed mystical expeditions to Tibet beyond the documented facts. Either these programs were so compartmentalized that even high-level scientists didn't know about them, or they simply didn't exist in the dramatic form that legends suggest. The missing archives. The other factor that feeds conspiracy theories is this. Enormous amounts of Nazi documentation were destroyed or lost. In the final weeks of the war, SS officers burned entire archives. Documents were scattered across occupied territories. The Soviets seized massive amounts of material and buried it in classified files for decades. Even today, German and Allied archives continue to release previously classified material. And every time they do, people hope it will contain the smoking gun, the document that proves Hitler escaped, or that Die Glocke worked, or that the Tibet expedition found something extraordinary. It never does. But the hope persists because as long as archives remain incomplete, anything seems possible. The pattern of myth-making. Let's look at how these myths develop using the Tibet expedition as an example. Stage 1. A real event happens. Nazi expedition goes to Tibet in 1938 to 1939. Stage 2. Some aspects remain unclear. The expedition's full activities aren't completely documented. This creates space for speculation. Stage 3. Post-war authors fill the gaps. Books claim the expedition searched for Shambhala, found hidden masters, or discovered ancient relics. Stage 4. Each retelling adds details. The hidden masters become more specific. The relics gain names and properties. The story becomes more dramatic. Stage 5. The myth solidifies. Eventually, the embellished version becomes more widely known than the documented facts. People cite each other's books as evidence, creating a circular reference loop. Stage 6. Skeptical historians debunk it. They point out lack of evidence, show where details were invented. Stage 7. Believers dismiss the debunking as part of the cover-up. Of course, official historians deny it. They're hiding the truth. This pattern repeats for Die Glocke, U-530, and dozens of other Nazi mysteries. You might wonder, who cares if people believe in Nazi occultism or hidden submarines? What's the harm? The harm is this. These myths distort our understanding of what actually happened in World War II. When we focus on bell-shaped devices and mystical relics, we're not focusing on the documented horror of the Holocaust. We're not studying how ordinary people enabled genocide. We're not learning the real lessons about how fascism rises and how democracies fail. The myths are seductive because they're more exciting than bureaucratic evil. A secret temple in Tibet is more cinematic than paperwork ordering death camps. An anti-gravity device is more thrilling than the mundane logistics of industrial murder. But history isn't supposed to be entertaining. It's supposed to be true. Here's the irony. While the Nazis were chasing mystical relics and impossible physics, they did develop genuinely revolutionary technology. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, advanced submarines, assault rifles, nerve gas. These weren't magical. They were the products of scientific research, engineering talent, and massive industrial capacity. The V-2 rocket, for instance, was a legitimate technological achievement. It pioneered techniques that would later put humans in space. But it was built by slave laborers dying in underground factories. The Me-262 jet fighter was the world's first operational jet aircraft, but it came too late to change the war's outcome. The Type 21 U-boat was generations ahead of earlier submarines, but only a handful became operational before the war ended. These were the real wonder weapons, not occult devices, but conventional technology pushed to its limits. And they didn't save the Reich because technology alone can't overcome strategic incompetence, resource shortages, and fighting the entire world at once. What all these Nazi programs, real and imagined, reveal is desperation. By 1944-45, Germany was losing. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were destroying cities. The invasion of Normandy had succeeded. Defeat was inevitable. In that context, the pursuit of wonder weapons makes a terrible kind of sense. When conventional means have failed, you grasp at unconventional solutions. When you're out of options, you try anything. If Himmler believed ancient Aryan knowledge might help, he'd fund expeditions to find it. If scientists claimed they could build revolutionary devices, commanders would allocate resources even if success seemed unlikely. This wasn't rational decision-making. It was a drowning man grabbing at straws. And that's what makes these mysteries ultimately sad. They represent not secret knowledge or hidden power, but the final thrashing of a doomed regime that had lost touch with reality. Conclusion: the mystery that matters. Let's recap what we know for certain. The Ahnenerbe was real. It conducted expeditions and research based on pseudo-scientific racial theories. The 1938 to 1939 Tibet expedition happened and returned with anthropological data used for propaganda. The Reese complex in the Owl Mountains was real. Prisoners died building it. Something was being tested or manufactured there, though exactly what remains partly unknown. U-530 crossed the Atlantic and surrendered in Argentina in July 1945 after destroying its logs. The crew's full story was never verified. Flight KG-867 vanished over the Bay of Bengal in June 1945 and was never found despite extensive searches. These are facts. Everything else, the mystical relics, the anti-gravity devices, the Hitler escape theories, is speculation built on absence of evidence rather than presence of proof. The real mystery. But here's what I want you to understand. The real mystery isn't about whether these specific legends are true. The real mystery is how a modern, industrialized, scientifically advanced nation could embrace an ideology so delusional that it sent expeditions to Tibet looking for mythical ancestors, poured resources into impossible physics experiments, and convinced itself that racial superiority was written in the stars. The real mystery is how millions of ordinary Germans, educated, cultured, sophisticated, participated in or enabled a regime that murdered millions while simultaneously believing they were creating a 1,000-year empire blessed by destiny. The real mystery is how the line between science and sorcery, between rational policy and mystical delusion, could become so blurred that the same organization running concentration camps was also funding expeditions to find the Holy Grail. That's what these unsolved mysteries really reveal. Not hidden Nazi technology or escaped war criminals, but the human capacity for self-deception on a massive scale. The lesson. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's about the danger of certainty. The Nazis were certain about their racial superiority, so certain that they were willing to murder millions to prove it, so certain that they searched the world for confirmation of their beliefs, interpreting every scrap of ambiguous evidence as validation. That certainty made them immune to facts. When the Tibet expedition found nothing mystical, they declared it a success anyway. When wonder weapons failed to materialize, they kept believing in the next one. When every rational indicator said they were losing the war, they convinced themselves victory was still possible. This is what happens when belief becomes more important than evidence. When ideology overrides reality. When the need to be right becomes more powerful than the willingness to be wrong. And that pattern, that dangerous pattern, didn't die with the Third Reich. The myths continue. Today, we still see people grasping for hidden explanations. Still see conspiracy theories flourishing in the absence of complete documentation. Still see the human tendency to prefer exciting lies over boring truths. The Nazi mysteries endure precisely because they offer that excitement. A bell-shaped device is more intriguing than a centrifuge. A submarine full of gold is more thrilling than a submarine full of desperate men. A mystic expedition to Tibet is more romantic than a racist photo op. But history isn't entertainment. And mysteries aren't always mysterious. Sometimes they're just incomplete because records were destroyed, witnesses died, or bureaucracies failed to document everything. The vast majority of unsolved Nazi mysteries have mundane explanations. We just don't like mundane. In the end, that might be the Nazis' final victory. They created so much secrecy, destroyed so many records, and left behind so much chaos that truth itself became difficult to establish. Even 80 years later, we're still arguing about what happened, still combing through archives, still publishing books claiming to reveal the truth about Nazi secrets. And every time we focus on mystical expeditions or impossible devices, we're not focusing on the documented, proven, horrible reality of what the Nazi regime actually did. We're not studying how ordinary people became complicit in genocide. We're not examining how democracies failed to stop fascism's rise. We're not learning how to recognize the warning signs when it happens again. Instead, we're chasing bell-shaped devices and submarines to Argentina. So here's where we land. Were there unsolved mysteries in World War II? Yes, absolutely. Wars create chaos, and chaos creates gaps in the record. Do those mysteries involve mystical relics or anti-gravity machines? Almost certainly not. Do they involve the final desperate activities of a collapsing regime? Definitely. That's what makes them historically interesting. Should we keep investigating them? Sure. Historical research should continue, archives should be examined, evidence should be evaluated. But should we let these mysteries overshadow the documented facts? Because the real story of the Nazi regime isn't about hidden temples or wonder weapons. It's about what happens when ideology becomes more important than truth, when racial mythology becomes national policy, when the state harnesses science, culture, and education in service of a delusional worldview. That's the story that matters. That's the mystery worth solving. Not whether Die Glocke existed, but how intelligent people convinced themselves it might work. Not whether U-530 carried Hitler, but how an entire nation followed him into catastrophe. Not whether the Tibet expedition found anything, but why they went looking in the first place. The shadow still falls. These mysteries, real and imagined, have shaped how we remember World War II. They've inspired countless books, documentaries, and movies. They've fueled conspiracy theories that persist to this day. They've created an entire industry of speculation about Nazi secrets. And in doing so, they've sometimes obscured the actual historical record. But perhaps that's inevitable. Perhaps every cataclysmic event creates these kinds of myths. Perhaps we need mysteries to help us process incomprehensible horror. Or perhaps we're just drawn to the idea that there's more to the story, that somewhere in the gaps and silences, there are secrets waiting to be discovered. I've given you the facts as we know them. I've shown you where evidence ends and speculation begins. I've tried to separate documented reality from post-war mythology. Now it's your turn to decide what to believe. But I'll leave you with this thought. The most important mysteries aren't about missing submarines or hidden relics. The most important mysteries are about us, about how we make sense of evil, about how we remember tragedy, about what we choose to focus on when studying history. Because every time we chase after Nazi occultism or wonder weapons, we make a choice about what aspects of World War II we think matter most. And that choice reveals as much about us as it does about them. Thanks for spending these 2 hours with me, diving into some of World War II's strangest unsolved mysteries. If you learned something, hit that subscribe button. If you have theories about any of these cases, drop a comment below. And remember, the real mystery isn't what the Nazis hid. It's what we're still trying to understand about how it happened at all.